Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be talking about an issue that some may equate with death and taxes, something that no one can ever get away from, and that is the situation in the Middle East. But tonight we have two guests who are taking active steps to try to help achieve a sense of justice in the Middle East. We have with us Gerard Horton from the Center for the Military Court Watch, and we have Salwa Duaibis from the Legal Aid and Women's Legal Aid and Counseling Center. So thank you both for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I should add that Salwa, you are also associated with the Military Court Watch as well, right? Both of you, in fact, are co-founders of that organization.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What are these organizations and why do they exist? Gerard, tell us a little bit about Military Court Watch.
So Military Court Watch is essentially a group of lawyers, Palestinian, Israeli, English, American lawyers. And we focus on one issue, and that is the prosecution of children aged between 12 and 17 in Israeli military courts in the West Bank. And essentially we focus on what happens to those children during the first 24 hours following their arrest.
I take it it's not good.
It's not good. And essentially we focus on that 24-hour period because that's when most of the issues of concern arise, whether it be denial of legal rights or mistreatment.
And Salwa?
Yes, as the name suggests, my organization tries to help women. So we provide legal aid and counseling to hundreds of women every year, women who suffer from violence within the family, who suffer from discrimination. So the organization also does awareness raising in the community. My job in the organization is basically to highlight or to shed light on the impact of Israeli human rights violations on women.
So it may seem that these are unconnected, but in fact they're very closely connected, are they not?
Yes, they are, because you can hardly talk about women's rights or the issues that affect women without properly addressing the issues that affect their children. So mothers who have their children arrested in the middle of the night in repeated night raids, terrifying night raids, and the children end up serving prison sentences is actually has a devastating effect on the child, on the mother, on the father, and the family as a whole, and the entire community.
And these sentences are not necessarily long, but they're still devastating, right? I mean, the average sentence period is fairly short, right?
Well, it's I think it's average, I would say, between 3 to 4 months, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. But for many of these kids, it's their first night ever to sleep outside the house. And so even a one night can be devastating.
And they can be as young as 12 or 13 and experience this, correct?
I think Gerard has more information about the details of
Gerard,
the
yeah, tell us a little more about what happens here.
So essentially, just to put it into some wider context, according to United Nations figures, since 1967, when martial law was imposed on the West Bank, something like 750,000 men, women and children have been prosecuted in these courts.
In military courts?
In military courts. According to the military authorities last year, it was 1,000 children went through the military court system. And what we've noticed with the evidence that we've collected is the first thing that became apparent was where the children are being arrested from. And it's essentially what we would call friction points. And a friction point is where an Israeli settlement has been constructed close to a Palestinian center of population.
In the West Bank.
In the West Bank. So the settlements, there's no serious dispute, are illegal under international law. They're
illegal under
under international law. Quite frequently, these villages where a settlement is constructed close to have lost land to that settlement. So that naturally causes friction. There's also a road system that connects the various settlements to each other and to Israel proper. Those roads pass close to Palestinian centers of population, and again, that causes friction. And the way that manifests itself in most cases is people throwing stones. People throwing stones at Israeli military vehicles, sometimes the buses the settlers travel in, or cars that settlers travel in. And the dilemma for the Israeli military is how do you guarantee the protection of those civilians, Israeli civilians, living in occupied territory, from anything from something very serious to children throwing stones at various locations.
And by the way, the children throwing stones, that's reason to be arrested and sent through these military courts.
Yes, it
right?
is. And I should add that throwing stones, sometimes it can be can involve danger, if you throw a stone at a moving vehicle. But we have come across cases as well where children have gone to prison for throwing stones at the wall, 3-month sentences for throwing stones at the wall. Another offence for which children and adults go to prison for is participating in protests. There's a military order that's been in effect for 47 years, which makes it illegal for more than 10 Palestinians to gather and to protest, unless they have already got a permit from the Israeli military commander.
But the permits are given out very sparingly, I'm sure.
Well, there's that, but also if you're Palestinian, you're unlikely to apply to an Israeli military commander for a permit to protest against the Israeli military.
Right.
So it simply doesn't happen. And that carries a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment. Not to say that people get 10 years for protesting, but you can go to prison for protesting.
There's so many questions to ask about that. That it seems outrageous. But Salwa, let me come back to you and talk a little bit about this arrest. And I'm getting the sense that this is not uncommon. This happens a lot, right? And what does that do to the social fabric of the family? How does that affect the mother and the father and the siblings?
Well, just to emphasize, these events are taking place in villages where a settlement was built next door. So in some cases, the settlement is built, not more than 500 meters away. And to give you an idea about how frequent these events take place, just in one village, in just 1 month, May of this year, one village was raided 16 times in 1 month. So it's every other night there was a night raid, a terrifying night raid.
This is the middle of the night, right?
Middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, midnight and on. And in some of these night raids, not always a person was arrested. So they are designed simply to terrify the population, to keep them under control so that they don't even think about resisting or objecting to the fact that their land is lost to the settlement, that they cannot use roads easily, that they don't have access to East Jerusalem, for example, that they basically don't open their mouths about the effect of a 47-year occupation on their lives.
And I, from what I hear, this is successful in that this, I hesitate to find words for it, but oppression is successful in keeping the disruption or public displays of dissatisfaction to a minimum, right?
Yes, well, a village that's raided 16 times in a month leaves entire communities sleep-deprived. And if you're a sleep-deprived person, you're unable to...
So they would raid every home in the village?
Well, they sometimes drive into the village, shoot sound grenades or tear gas, wake people up, make noise in the village so that everybody wakes up. And this is what mothers tell me, that they go to bed at 5 in the morning when it is less likely that the army will break into their houses, either to search or to arrest someone. And it is not uncommon for somebody to walk into a Palestinian house at 3 in the afternoon and find women and children sleeping, either on the couch or in the bedroom. When I first encountered this, I thought, something is wrong with this community. And then the explanation was that the night before, nobody could sleep.
Because of the raid.
Because of the army in the village.
Again, that raises so many questions that I need to come back. But Gerard, so why is this in a military court? I mean, these in the United States, for example, if you throw a stone at a car, it's a civil offense, and you would be, if you were arrested at all for that, you would come and face a civilian court. Why is it military?
Well, because in 1967, the Israeli military occupied the West Bank under international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention. What's supposed to happen is the law that was in place in that area prior to the occupation should remain in place. But there's an exception, and that is under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the military authorities can, on top of the civilian law, impose a level of military law in circumstances to protect their own security, so in limited circumstances. And if someone breaks that law, they can establish military courts to try civilians who have broken that law. Now, that's an undesirable situation to go on for too long, and that's why under international law, where you do have a situation of military occupation, it must be temporary. And that's the big problem here, that we're now in the 47th year of this, which is hardly temporary.
By anyone's definition, it's hard to call that temporary.
Exactly. And in addition to that, you have the transfer of Israeli civilians into the occupied territory, about 500,000 of them living there, which again violates the Fourth Geneva Convention. And this, as we've discussed a little bit, causes massive amount of friction and tension, inevitably, in that area. And in order to control that friction and tension, generation after generation of young people have been put through these military courts.
Is there any civilian court system, or is it all the military courts?
It's for this situation. It's well, it's interesting. Israeli military law applies to all of the West Bank, applies to anyone in the West Bank, whether they're Palestinian or an Israeli civilian living there. Interestingly, it's the Palestinians are put through the military court system, and then in reality, in practice, the Israeli civilians living in the settlements are put through civilian courts. And those civilian courts have far greater rights and protections than the military courts do. And so you have a very unsatisfactory situation, to say the least, where you have two communities living next door to each other, one Palestinian, one Israeli civilians in a settlement. And let's imagine that situation where you have children coming out of each of those communities and they start throwing stones at each other. The Palestinian children who were throwing stones will be prosecuted in a military court, frequently arrested in the middle of the night, not informed of their rights. Even under military law, they do have some rights like the right to silence, the right to consult with a lawyer. Frequently that doesn't happen. They're not informed of those rights. They're usually painfully tied by their hands with a single zip tie, sometimes remaining tied like that for 6 to 12 hours, blindfolded. Their parents generally are not informed why they've been arrested or where they've been taken to. And then it will take 6 to 12 hours to transfer that child to an interrogation center. During that time, they might be just left outside somewhere.
Tied up and blindfolded.
Tied up and blindfolded. If they try to sleep, they're slapped to keep them awake. So a fairly, to put it mildly, miserable situation. By the time they get to the interrogation center, psychologically they're very weakened. Their hands are painful. They're highly concerned by the fact that they know their parents don't know where they are. And so you can imagine the state they're in when they're finally questioned about whatever incident or accusation.
With no lawyer present.
With no lawyer present. The child from the settlement, on the other hand, under Israeli civilian law, cannot be interrogated at night, so will not be arrested at night, will generally be summoned, so will go down to the police station with his mother or father during the day, will get to see a lawyer, will be told they have the right to silence, cannot get a custodial sentence until they're 14 years old, whereas the Palestinian child can be locked up at 12. And then at the end of that process, if the Israeli settler child is convicted of an offense, they have a 6.5% chance of getting a custodial sentence. Whereas in the military courts, according to the military courts themselves, the conviction rates are 99.74%.
All of those convictions end up going to jail,
yes,
right?
Pretty much, yeah.
So it's shocking to hear this. I mean, this is not information that's generally shared with the American public. I know that former President Jimmy Carter, a number of years ago, referred to the situation as apartheid and was resoundingly criticized here in the United States for that. But is that really an apt description? Salwa, is that what we think is going on?
I don't know. I wouldn't give the situation any labels. I mean, my job is to simply describe the facts on the ground. I know that the effect of this prolonged occupation is has a devastating effect on on families and children. Parents have a deep sense of failure. They feel that they have failed to protect their own children inside their own homes. The message that they get from these practices is that there's nothing that they can do basically to protect their children, because it's not a system that makes an effort to apply justice. It simply makes no effort. So mothers who actually haven't gone through this experience show severe physical symptoms of severe stress, because they're simply still waiting and anticipating their worst nightmare coming true. And the mothers who went through this experience repeated times, the pain is so intense that they have learned how to desensitize themselves to pain, so they become numb. And this is just a recipe for a disaster, inside the family. When the parents are dysfunctional, the children are dysfunctional. Many of these children drop out of school. They lose interest in school. A study actually in the United States, I once read, if I'm not mistaken, showed that the children put in prison are 13 times more likely to drop out of school. And I think the worst thing is that when kids go out of prison, they come with a deep sense of lack of security. They have lost respect for their parents who couldn't protect them. They rebel. It's difficult to raise a 16-year-old boy in the best of circumstances. Can you imagine trying to discipline a boy who's gone through a terrible experience? Sometimes for committing something that's wrong, sometimes simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And
can still, as you say, a 99 or
99.74%. Yeah.
So to summarize, I think the situation here, the conflict, in my opinion, can be summarized in a simple sentence, and that is that the Israelis want to take as much land as possible with as little Palestinians as possible. So that is why there's a lot of pressure on Palestinians living next door to settlements, where the settlement was built. There's tremendous pressure. This is where the repeated night raids happen. This is where the children are being arrested. This is where the land is being taken. And the message is life will be hell for you. And if you want a better life, leave. Go to Ramallah, where life is more or less bearable.
Until the
it's
Israelis
basically
move to
jamming,
Ramallah, right.
Jamming Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of them, in very small geographical areas, so that Israeli settlements can continue to grow illegally, and settlers can go on their normal lives, as if they're living in their own country. So basically, the price on the Palestinian community has to be maximized so that there's little resistance, and life for the Israeli settlers who live in settlements has to be as normal as possible. And in order to achieve this objective, this is what you need to do. You have to do it night after night, house after house, year after year. And this is what is basically, the success of this project is, sadly, is so great that it's not funny anymore. I'm sorry to say this.
I don't think anyone assumed that.
No, I know,
at any point, right?
no, it's just hard to communicate the impact that this has had on a community, an entire community for many, many years. And this is just one issue. Multiply this by tens of other issues, by 47 years.
Yeah.
So you get a situation that's very desperate.
Gerard, this is, I consider myself a pretty informed person. I try to read the newspaper. I those old-fashioned things, papers that fall over. But I read the news online. I subscribe to a number of different magazines from different political perspectives. And this level of injustice is news to me. And I consider myself actually a pretty well-informed person. What's going on here? Why is this not more widely known?
Very good question. In some ways that changed maybe a little bit this year. There was an Australian, the Australian Broadcasting Company, so that's the main government-owned television channel in Australia, did a documentary on this subject called Stone Cold Justice. And you can Google it, it's available online. And what was remarkable about that, one of the remarkable things, I think, it was in conjunction with Australia's main newspaper, The Australian, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So it's a conservative newspaper. And so it reached a much wider audience. So when that documentary aired at 7:30 p.m., so primetime television in Australia, over 1 million people saw it. And it had a dramatic impact. So there was a response from the government about the issue. It's now gone up the political agenda in Australia. Likewise in Britain, as part of our work, we take a number of parliamentary delegations to the military courts. So over the years, I think we've taken probably 50 or 60 UK parliamentarians to the military courts. And again, that raises the political profile of the issue. Less so with, we haven't had that kind of publicity in America yet. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're here to provide some more information to people. But the more people who can see what's going on and can ask some really simple questions. And I think another way of looking at it is this, and that is there are now something like 500,000, 500,000 Israeli civilians living in the West Bank in violation of international law. Think of it another way. Imagine if, say, America decided to put 500,000 American civilians into Afghanistan and told them build villages and towns and hospitals and schools.
But don't let the Afghans participate.
Can you imagine the level of bloodshed that would occur from a situation like that? And the question is, how do you put that many civilians into occupied territory and suppress the local population? And I think what is truly remarkable about what the military in the West Bank has achieved is, according to the US State Department, the US State Department produces a report on human rights every year. In 2012, no settlers were killed. In the last 3 years, 7 settlers out of 500,000
over a 3-year period.
Over a 3-year period have been killed. Now I don't mean to trivialize those deaths, but when you think of it in military terms, that's an extraordinary achievement, that you have 500,000 civilians in occupied territory and the casualty rates are so low, given the frictions and the tensions. And I would say, try doing that in Afghanistan and see what happens.
Try doing that in Chicago.
Exactly.
Murder rate's higher here.
Exactly. And the question is, how has that been achieved? And the military courts and the detention of children is largely the answer to that. It's mass intimidation and collective punishment. So that I'm not saying, and we're not saying there isn't any resistance, but when there is resistance, even when the perpetrators cannot be identified because they've run off, the nearest Palestinian village will collectively pay the price for that until they get the message that resistance is futile.
And collective punishment is also illegal under international law, correct?
Yeah. And I think I would just add that I think what this demonstrates is there is no nice way, there is no legal way to do prolonged military occupation with settlement construction. It is going to involve mass intimidation and collective punishment, as we've described. And there is, in fairness to the military, there's no other way of doing it. And that's one of the reasons why it's illegal.
What this brings to mind, Hannah Arendt, a famous book about World War II, and I will get no end of criticism for using the word Nazis, but she was describing what she called the banality of evil, how everyday people just accepted this as, well, pretty normal. And so it brings to mind the question about the Israeli settlers who live there, who at some level must know that this is going on. But I've read an article maybe somewhere in the last year or so about an Israeli settler, a young family, said, well, why, the interviewer was asking, well, why did you move to the settlements? It's dangerous or whatever. And they said, well, it's the best value for the money. I could get a condo there that I can't possibly afford here in Jerusalem, for example. And the idea of that really the decision was just made as though you're changing a neighborhood in Chicago. I'm going to move to Rogers Park instead of Evanston or whatever. And that's what brings to mind the question, how do the Israeli settlers feel about it? Do they know? And if so, how do they internalize that?
I think it's you can't generalize. So the people move to the settlements for different reasons. And I think the data shows that the data I've seen indicates that around 30% of the settlers are ideological. So God gave us this land, therefore we will settle it. The other 70% though are economic settlements. It's you get government incentives to move there, you get free childcare. It makes good financial reason to move to a settlement, and that's 70% of the settlers. The problem though is that obviously it comes with all these other issues, and the way I think I can best describe it is, imagine a glassy pond, and in a sense a settlement is like a stone being thrown into the middle of that pond, and you'll have a ripple effect coming out of that. And each of those ripples is a human rights violation, and there's simply no other way of doing it. You will have mass arrests, night raids, land confiscation, etc., 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 and that's the way the process works.
Yep.
So, Salwa, I want to, before we're going to run out of time here,
Right.
believe it or not. So I want to make sure that the people who are watching now have some sense of something they can do about this.
Yeah, I mean, the Middle East conflict seems to be
it's
so
defied
complicated,
resolution by
so complicated,
many very
and
smart
so
and dedicated people. But still,
has gone on for such a long time that we all feel overwhelmed. But I think it's the little drops in the ocean that will eventually make a huge difference. For example, I think there's a lot of information about the conflict, not in the mainstream media, but elsewhere, like our two organizations constantly feed information about what it is like, what life is like for ordinary Palestinian men, women, and children.
by the way, could this go on without U.S. support? And if you could change the feeling of the United States, if this could become as it did in Australia, might that affect change on the ground in Israel-Palestine?
I want to go back to the settlement issue. I don't think, I think it's a mistake to assume that individual settlers make the individual decision to settle in the occupied territory. I think the driving force behind the settlement project is the Israeli government, because they provide the incentives, they build the infrastructure, they do what is necessary to move their own civilians into occupied territory. And without particularly American financial, military, and political support, I don't think this would be possible, unfortunately. So that is why American citizens have an obligation, first of all, to understand what exactly is going on, and to make sure that they inform their elected representatives about what is going on, and then to make sure that any assistance that they give to Israel is not causing abuses.
Further injustice.
Exactly.
Well, that has to be the last word because we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for being here. It's been extremely educational for me, and I hope for anyone who's watching this show as well. And I hope you will come back because your work is so important. I'd like to hear about it again.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Salwa, Gerard, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again for Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and you can find us on Comcast Channel 19 every Saturday night at 8, and see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.
Thank you.